No, I know, but what I mean is people have always participated. Like you take a community of Homo sapiens 20,000 years ago, they were all participating. People living in small communities that are self-sufficient are all participating. What's happened is that the intervention of organizations, of development, of government, of services, and all the rest of it has, to some extent, made people dependent on the state. To some extent, has inhibited self-help and participation. So it's always been there. And I mean, if you take the example of Kenya, for instance, you know, people will talk about participation now in the 21st century, blah, blah. If you go back to before independence in Kenya, there was a huge amount of training that took place under the colonial regime. I'm not trying to justify colonialism or anything like that, but the fact is, and I know this, there was a tremendous amount of training of people in the basic elements of self-help. Things like accounting, absolutely crucial. At the time of independence, what happened? A huge national movement. It wasn't coordinated, it was spontaneous, called the Harambee movement, in which people in communities built schools, they built dips, they built health centers, they demanded the services. They did this all on their own. And one of the reasons they could do this was because they had the capability, but they desperately wanted it, and they believed that they could achieve it. So it was a huge amount of participation, which was spontaneous. It wasn't, the government was embarrassed because it couldn't meet the demands which were coming up. I think a lot of the issue around participation is in terms of the attitudes and behavior and orientation of people working in bureaucracies, of people from outside. That their attitude is one of providing, of delivering, rather than one of enabling, of facilitating people to do their own analysis, to come to their own conclusions, and to take their own action. So participation is inhibited by the state, by the agents of the state, by their behavior and their attitudes. Take IEC, information, education, communication. What's implied by that? We know, and you
do it.
You're ignorant. No, you're ignorant. We have to teach you. And once you're in a teaching mode, you're disabled from enabling people to participate, to do things for themselves. So teaching disables people. The opportunity is change in the behavior and the attitudes and orientation and mindsets of people in NGOs and in government. And this is at all levels, because one way of looking at this is thinking of us as magnets. Now, if somebody goes through primary school, secondary school, university, and they're taught and taught and taught, and they do well by reproducing to the teacher and in the examinations what they have been taught, it is as though they have been magnetized to look up to an authority. And if they come out of university magnetized, not only do they look up for an authority, which means they fit very nicely into a bureaucracy or into a hierarchical NGO, but also they've got a strong North Pole, as it were, up there, but they've also looked for somebody to boss. And so educational systems, through the orientation that they give to people, produce them as people who will fit nicely into top-down bureaucracies. And so they're in a way disabled. We are disabled by our educational systems because we're taught that there's an authority and they're taught that we can be a boss. And so one of the big challenges that we face is changing the way in which our educational systems operate. If you think about children in primary school, young children are very, very creative. In a way, when you see young children playing, this is the most creative phase in anyone's life when they're very, very small, before they've been damaged by being taught. I mean, I'll just tell you a story because it's a good one. The story is this, and I believe it's true. There was a little girl was sitting down, and she was drawing. She was maybe 6, 7, 8, something like that. And the teacher came up to her and said, "What are you drawing?" The little girl looked up and she said, "I'm drawing God." And the teacher said, "But you can't draw God. Nobody knows what God looks like." And the little girl said, "They will soon." You see, there's this wonderful creative phase, uninhibited, that we go through, but it's drilled out of us by the educational systems. And so you end up with these hurry. I'm not talking about any particular culture. I mean, this is all over the world. And I think one of the great challenges of the 21st century is to transform our educational systems to allow that creativity to flower instead of forcing it to wither and shrink and die. And it's possible. You see, you really can do this. There are ways of going about secondary education. Some of the very best schools do this. In the early days of PRA, Participatory Rural Appraisal, in India, one of the most fascinating things was that the people who were best at it, the people who were most original, the people who were most inventive, had by and large had very unusual upbringings and had been to rather unusual secondary schools.
Really?
Yes.
And you collected that information?
I came to understand it by getting to know them and by chatting. So what is the inference? The inference is that all our schools should be like that. But then all our teachers have got to be like that. And the teachers themselves have been disabled by their education, by their teacher training, by sitting in rows, by being taught, nowadays by bloody PowerPoint. You know, by all this huge sort of technological authority which is thrust on them, that this is the truth, this is what you've got to learn. Instead of encouraging people to be creative, to think differently, to have that sort of diversity that we need, which is also enormously fulfilling. To have the freedom to do things differently and to be encouraged, you know, instead of having to conform. All our societies are much too conformist. We should be celebrating dissent, diversity. Who counts reality?
Who counts reality?
The phrase is not mine, it was John Juventus, my colleague. But who counts reality? Well, this was the extraordinary discovery in 1991. It was Bimal Phanu Yao in Action Aid in Nepal, in Sindhupal Chowk district, which is where they'd had a program. They used participatory mapping in over 130 villages as a utilization survey for monitoring what they had achieved with what was basically a service delivery program. So it was, you know, latrines, it was water supply, maybe something to do with housing. There were health items as well. And they did all this with maps. So they made maps in all these communities. Well, the people in the community made the maps. They showed all the houses, and then they used markers and stickers and things to represent the different characteristics in terms of access to services and services which had been delivered. So this generated numbers which were commensurable. That's to say, you could take you've got the same sort of numbers from the different communities, so you could put them all together, which ended up with tables. There are 13 tables in the report. This is 1991. There are 30 these tables look just as though they've come out of a questionnaire survey, but almost certainly far more accurate than anything that would have come out of a questionnaire, because it's cross-checked. It's this thing we call group visual synergy. People are trying to get it right, and they say, "Come on, you've forgotten, you know, that there's somebody else in that. She's had a baby, you know. Put in another person." You know, they can see what's being said, so they can cross-check. So out of this, the population was 35,400 and something. You know, it's all there. And the different communities, the different ethnic groups, the different services, all the numbers are there in these tables. So that was a huge breakthrough. It was their numbers which were almost certainly very, very accurate. Whereas you think of the numbers that come out of a questionnaire survey, they're very often distorted, invented, unreliable. You don't, with a questionnaire, you don't know how accurate the figures are in the way that you do with participatory mapping. So, okay, so that's one way in which numbers can be generated. Now, people can generate numbers in other ways, which they can use in leveling the power relationship with government. Another source of numbers is very close to number is participatory GIS, which is a huge international movement now. Huge. In the Amazon, they've used the last figure I had, which is a couple of years ago. Something like over 200 communities in the Amazon have used participatory GIS to show what their territories are, to defend their territories. So huge potential for empowerment. It's been used with a lot of indigenous people around the world. So that's, I mean, it's not exactly numbers, but it's very close to it because it can generate numbers for areas. And also they make the most wonderful 3D models now, which are made using participatory GIS. That's something that started in the Philippines. The potential of the numbers generated by people, A, empowering them, but B, actually correcting official figures. And then you may look, or you may look at a phenomenon, let's say, like poverty, and then you ask people what are the causes of poverty, and they put these down and they draw lines to show the connections, and then what are the effects of poverty, and they draw lines for those, and then sometimes you find that theft is both a cause and an effect, so you join them, because it very often is, and theft is a much neglected aspect of poverty and of impoverishment. And if you take matrix scoring, that can be used for making comparisons between different varieties of crop, between different services, between different trees, between different soil conditions or agroecological zones, innumerable applications. But with all of these, one of the key elements is that people themselves learn through expressing their reality. People say things like, well, this is our reality. We knew this, but we never saw it like this before. And the same thing happens with any of us. If I ask you to draw a map of the environment around your home, when you have finished drawing the map, you will have a different view of the environment around your home and what you know about it and what you don't know about it than you would have done before. And if you ask your children to draw a map around your home, of the environment around your home, if you live in a village like me, you will find that they have the ability to produce a far more detailed map than you do.
Yes.
Because they know so much more. They spend so much more time in the village. And they will draw things big, which you would have drawn small. The playground, if you've got small children, they will draw the playground really big. So it will demonstrate their sense of priorities and what's important. And then if you compare the different maps in the family, it's fascinating because women have got a different map from men. They show different things. Children have got different maps again. Teenagers will have another different sort of map. And you can compare them all, and then you begin to understand one another's different realities. So it can be very helpful in relationships as well. There are a lot of issues around our mindsets and how we see things, and also about how we think action should be taken. And one of these mindsets, which is associated with scientific rigor, with high status, with dominant modes of thinking about interventions, including government interventions, is based on the idea of controlled and controllable environments. If you think of the highest status among the medical professions, or the highest status among the agricultural professions, it's likely to lead to very, very highly controlled conditions, the conditions of an operating theatre for organ transfer or for microsurgery, the conditions of a laboratory for the manipulation of genes, highly controlled, in which it is possible to carry out fairly precise activities with a fairly high reliability. And that's the very high status that we reward. And then if you take the medical model and the agricultural model, let's explore them both in terms of what has been very successful, and then the mindsets that this implies. If you take the medical model, some of the most successful medical interventions have been immunization. Very top down, very standardized. Why does immunization work? It works because what is injected is highly standardized and controlled. And we know about the cold chain and all that. You have to control that, but if it's highly standardized and controlled, the human body is homeostatically highly controlled and very, very standardized in terms of many, many of its dimensions. Your body, although we look slightly different, your body and my body are virtually identical along a whole range of dimensions, including temperature. I mean, your temperature and my temperature, probably a fraction of a degree different at the moment.
Blood pressure, and it has to be within that limit, otherwise you are sick.
Very, very tightly controlled. So it's a controlled input, and it's a controlled receiving environment, and it's a predictable outcome. You are immunized and you will not get measles or polio or whatever it is. So it works. And the people say, brilliant, it works, it works, it works. So that's our mindset. We've got to do things like that. We've got to have these standardized inputs. Then you take agriculture. What's the great successes of agriculture? Well, there are some that are claimed with genetic engineering, although the outcomes have been really quite dodgy and ambivalent, I think. But leave it genetic engineering. The Green Revolution. Take the Green Revolution. The conditions on the research station were quite highly controlled. I'm talking about northwest India. Fairly low rainfall, irrigation pretty reliable. Land flat. Land ownership determined. Problem and opportunity. Problem, when you apply nitrogen fertilizer to wheat, it grows so well that it grows tall, and then it lodges. When the rain comes or the wind comes, it falls over. Solution, Norman Borlaug, Dr. Swaminathan, between them. The solution, you have short stem variety with a lot of silicon, which makes it strong in the stem. It grows only a short height and it doesn't fall over. Result, Green Revolution. Massive increase in production. So, a Nobel Prize for Borlaug, and recognition not as great at the time as he should have had, but recognition for Dr. Swaminathan. So this is the model, this is the great success. So what do agricultural scientists do? Not only in India, but around the world. They look for their own green revolution, but they're very often not operating in the same conditions. The research station conditions and the conditions on the farmer's field are very, very different. The research station may be flat, but the farmer's fields may be undulating. The research station may have water control. The farmer's fields may not have water control. They may not have irrigation. So you need a very different model, and it's not a model which can operate necessarily or be effective necessarily on a very large scale. Northwest India, yes, very large scale, because Punjab and Haryana, huge. And bits of Rajasthan, absolutely huge. But in other parts of India, no. So trying to apply that model in other parts of India and of the world, of trying to breed varieties and to test varieties which would do well in a whole range of different conditions, was not an optimal way of going about it. Because an environment which, a variety which would do well in a whole range of different conditions might not be the best variety for any one of those conditions. So you need a different model, which is a model of diversity, of local innovation, of adaptation, something which fits particular conditions in particular areas. And who are the experts on that? The farmers themselves. They know very often much more. The relative balance of advantage of scientist knowledge and of farmers' knowledge tilts towards farmers' knowledge when we move into what we sometimes call CDR conditions, complex, diverse and risk-prone conditions, which is most of the agriculture of the rest of the rest of the world. If there's a lot of diversity of conditions, of culture, a whole range of dimensions of accessibility, then the people who are best able to express what is needed in those conditions are usually the people who are living there. And so being democratic, being participatory, enabling them to express their priorities leads to generally more effective ways of enabling them to get what they want, of local development, than having standardized top-down programs. So you need to change the mindset from one of we've got to think of a solution and then we write a government order or a circular and then this is something which is going to be done everywhere. From that mindset, or that there's got to be a standard sort of latrine or whatever it is everywhere, you move from that mindset into one of saying we must have a standardized enabling set of conditions which allow people to generate their own diversity that fits their own local conditions and needs. It's a big change of mindset because it's a release of power and control. But the power and control don't work. I mean, the standardization does not work for much of the world, and I would say probably for much of India, for many programs and many conditions. If we ask what has enabled poor people sometimes to become less poor, but if we also ask the question, which is not asked much, and I will concentrate on this one, what is it that makes poor people poorer? Anirudh Krishna has developed a brilliant methodology. He developed this in Rajasthan. It took him 6 months to develop the methodology. He has written about this and he said, after 4 months I was in despair. But he got there and he has developed a methodology which has now been used in at least 6 countries. And the findings have been the same everywhere, give or take a little bit of variance. The methodology is called the stages of progress. He asks people in a community, if someone is very, very poor and get a little bit more money, what will they spend it on? And then if they get a little bit more money than that, what will they spend it on? And then if they get a little bit more than that, what will they spend it on? And that way you get a sequence of what people will spend their extra bit of money on. He then has asked, in Rajasthan, it was 25 years ago, he asked 25 years ago, this household, where were they on this scale? And today, where are they on this scale? And people answer these things in groups and they debate and discuss. And that way, you can discover who has got better off and who's got worse off in their perceptions. And then you can ask, what was the pathway? And so you get a timeline of their experience, what enabled them to become better off and what pushed them down. Do you know what pushes them down in the United States, in India, in East Africa, in every country? One thing pushes them down more than others, with one exception, but it was trivial exception. Sickness. It's sickness. Sickness. As professionals, economists, health people, social scientists, all of us, is it not the case that we underestimate the importance of the body, the physical body, to poor people? If you think of it, what is the main asset? You mentioned assets. What is the main asset that many poor people have? It's this. It's the body. They labour, or they sew, or they stitch, or whatever it is that they do. But the body is what they need to do their work. So the body, if the body is the main asset, and savers women have got a big poster, and at the top it says, our bodies are our wealth. Their capital. It's their reality which they have expressed in this poster. It's right at the top. It's the most important thing. So the body, if you think of the body as an asset, compare it with a bank account or with goats. A bank account and goats, they're divisible. You can sell one goat, or if one goat dies or gets sick, too bad, but you've got other goats. If you lose a bit of money, you lose a bit of money. You can draw a little bit from the bank account, or you can draw a lot. The body is indivisible. If it's sick, the whole body is sick. The body is uninsured, usually for most poor people. And most seriously of all, whereas if you lose all the money in your bank account, or all your goats die, well, that's too bad. You've lost them. But at least they haven't become a liability. But if this indivisible, uninsured asset of a poor person becomes sick, it becomes immediately a liability. And this is a terrible, terrible difference between the body as the main asset of poor people and other ones. Think of the liability. The main earner, breadwinner in a family, suddenly has an accident and has to stay at home, has to be fed, they need medicines, they may need treatment. There's the dilemma, if they're short of money, about whether to go for treatment or not, and what sort of treatment to go for. Usually the cheapest first, and then the next cheapest. And if people are really poor, they won't go for the more expensive first of all. They'll try the cheapest, and then the next, and then the next. But by the time they're getting to the next and the next, where they've got a better chance, the person who's sick has got even sicker. So they're caught in a trap, which middle-class people are not caught in. And then when they go for treatment, they're very often the last in the queue. This is a complaint all over the world, and health staff treat them badly. People say, I will never ever go to that clinic again because I was so humiliated. You see, so where this is driving is to a point which I do not think is realized adequately by economists and by health professionals. And that is that the cost effectiveness in terms of any anti-poverty program, any pro-poor program, the cost effectiveness of free, accessible and effective health services is far greater than is recognized in terms of the benefits to poor people. But do you hear this point of view put? I don't. I've shared this with health professionals, and they're quite surprised. I ask people to brainstorm about the characteristics of the body as the main asset that people have. And you know, they're very often, I mean, I did this recently with quite a bunch of professionals, actually in Sweden. They were development analysts. There were about 55 of them, development analysts in CEDA. And I said, what are the main characteristics of the body as an asset? They didn't get indivisibility. They didn't get uninsured. They got flipping. They didn't actually explicitly get flipping from being an asset into being a liability. So you see, the body is so bloody important to poor people. And health services are so important. And we have this idea, the priority for poor people is education, educate. You ask them what their priority is. Very often, and this is sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world, their top priority is a good, effective access to a good health service. But then you see, if you take, that's on the negative side, the causes of poverty. And having a disabled family member who's become a liability is something which can really drag a family down. And we have neglected accidents and the importance of accidents and the importance of safety for people. I mean, look at people who work loading and unloading lorries, you know, all over India. Very, very dangerous job. Look at people who work in quarries. Let me give you an example. I sat in Tamil Nadu with some quarry workers. There were about 20 of them. And we talked about their life. And I said, isn't it very dangerous? And they said, yes, it is. We have quite serious injuries. And they showed me their injuries. And all of them, except the two youngest, had got quite bad scars. So I said, what do you do about this? And they said, we have a fund. We all contribute to this fund. And if any one of us gets injured, we get the best possible treatment that we can afford for that person, because the body is the source of livelihood. Jogging near Surajkund in the early morning, about 10 years ago, there were explosions going on.
Explosions.
Yeah, because they were blowing up, they were mining. Yeah, at Surajkund. Yes,
Oh.
terrible. And as I was jogging, there was a man who stopped me. And he was acting as a guard. And he'd got a whole arm missing. So there they'd hung together. This man had lost his arm as a quarry worker, blown off almost certainly. But they were continuing to give him employment through solidarity, one guesses, as a guard to stop other people going in there like me and getting ourselves blown up. But you know, it's this whole business about the body. And once people are disabled, the danger is that they don't get a job like that guard, but that they become a liability. And then the family has to feed them. And then their best contribution to the family is to eat less. It's terrible. You know, and that happens with old people. The best contribution they can make to their family is to eat less. Stealing food in rural areas, there tend to be quite nuanced understandings that taking a little bit, if you're very, very hungry and very, very poor, is okay. But when it becomes on a larger scale, then that's not okay, and it's impoverishing for the person who's grown the crop and invested a lot in growing it, and of course their land. And so they have abandoned the faba bean in parts of Ethiopia. They're not growing it anymore, and they're having a much less nutritious diet. And it's all because of theft. In Malawi, they used to have, and in many parts of Africa, they used to have a tradition that the crop is outside the hut, it's on stilts, and it's it's a storage bin, or sort of a storage structure, and you have ways of stopping the rats getting up and all the rest of it. In Malawi, I'm told again and again by people who I've been cross-questioning, they don't do that anymore. There has been so much theft of food from stores outside houses that the food is being stored inside the house. So of course they've got less living room, but they've got it more securely. The theft of livestock is a major issue in many parts of Africa. The point is that not necessarily livestock theft, because that's always been there, but the theft of crops has become more serious. And so that's another cause of impoverishment. So what is the solution to that? Well, the cause of that is poverty. Theft is a livelihood strategy. There have been people who've said, I don't like doing this, but I have to feed my family. So there are reluctant thieves who are driven by poverty into impoverishing other people. And this is a very tragic syndrome. And what is the solution? The solution is, of course, agricultural development, growing more crops, more equitable systems, and a bit of law and order. But the law and order is very difficult if it's stealing crops. Very difficult. Let me tell you a story then, which is similar. Mina Bilgi was working on gender with the Alkan Rural Support Program, India, AKRSP, in Gujarat. And she was working with the women in the community. And she was having a lot of difficulty with the men. The men were objecting and saying, what are you doing, messing with our women and all the rest of it. So she didn't know what to do. So she decided she would sit down with the men and she would ask the men to analyze how the women spent their time. So they did that. And they did exactly what you're saying. And when they did this, and they saw what their wives were doing, they said, according to Mina, they said, we don't believe this. I mean, they couldn't believe that their wives were doing, or their women, were doing so much. And after that, she had no trouble. And not only that, but they changed, and they started doing some of the things and helping in ways, doing some of the tasks which their women had done before. I mean, several times in my life, many times actually, I've seen the faces of women which have, there's something just awful. There's a sort of blankness. It's a sort of deep hurt which they've experienced, which has made them sort of unemotional, almost dead. It's almost like a dead face that you see. It's terrible. And you think of the relationships, of the experiences, that the harassment, the bullying, the tyranny, which must have gone into making that person have such a terrible, frightening, dead face. I feel so sorry for people who are trapped in that sort of way. And you see, well, that was one case. You could just see it. Profoundly unhappy, no joy in life. Awful. So there's a huge potential for, I don't know if transforming is too strong a word, but certainly for moderating and for altering gender relations and other power relations. And so much of this participation is about power relations. We tend not to talk about power, but it's absolutely central to all this.
It's only about, power.
And the idea that the outsider has got power, but it's power, and this is something which I shall do in coaching in the workshop. But it's power to empower. If you have power over, you can use that as power to empower other people. And that can be very fulfilling for the person with power over. If the person with power over transforms their mindset from one of wishing to control to one of wishing to empower. And, you know, good teachers do this. They empower their pupils and they take delight and feel fulfilled by what their pupils go off and do later in their lives. You know, I mean, and also it's very often just very good fun. I mean, the word fun is not in our vocabulary enough. I mean, I think everyone has a basic human right to fun. And some people people who are disabled, who are in pain, who are sick, and some women who are trapped in very, very unhappy marriages, they don't have any scope for fun, really.
Yeah, like
But they're denied that human right. I mean, human right to enjoy life. I think that women's groups and women's movements are one of the most powerful engines of change. In Bangladesh, they've been transformative, I think. I mean, huge changes socially in Bangladesh over the last 20 years. Huge drop in the fertility rate. And I think a lot of this is to do with women's empowerment through their own groups. And the same thing, I'm sure, in India. Movements like Seva, large organizations like Mahila Samata, or Samakya, well, it's Samakya in one place and Samata in another. But that is a very, very remarkable movement. There's been a recent extraordinary movement in Andhra Pradesh for
Indira Kranti Patham.
Yeah, it's to do with reducing the use of or eliminating the use of pesticides, I think. But that's been linked with Mahila Samakya. But women's movements have got a huge potential for transformation, but a transformation of gender relations as well. Now, when we talk about moving in a positive direction, we tend to think economically. And I don't want to underplay the importance of the economic dimension. You know, productive assets, loans, productive assets, microfinance, and so on. Microfinance, sometimes good, sometimes not so good, because if it puts people in debt, which gives them trouble. But so there's that economic dimension, which may be in agriculture, it may be in all different forms of employment, in livelihood diversification, and so on. And that can be very positive. But if we look at what makes a good life for people, if we start with a different question, we don't start with our definition of poverty, which tends to be income, which is reductionist, which comes out of economics. The poverty line is our definition of a cut-off, and leave aside whether it's well measured or not. The fact is that it's not their reality, which is very often different. If you do wealth ranking or well-being ranking in a community, they'll come out with something completely different, and they will explain to you in detail why the poverty line gets it wrong. And some people are above who shouldn't be, and some are below. You know, they know they've got a different reality, which is much more multidimensional. You see, we are reductionists. We just like to have one measure. Very convenient. You can add it up, you can sum it, you can write articles in the EPW about it until the cows come home. I'm not making a joke about cows. It's just a conventional expression. You know, you can go on endlessly. But if you ask people themselves what really matters to you, then many other dimensions come out as being significant. Relationships come out as being very significant. Security comes out as being very secure. Not being vulnerable. Powerlessness. You know. And sometimes people say there are five dimensions. One is material, which includes the poverty line, but it's much more than that, because it includes shelter. Shelter is more important, and it's around the world, in poor people's perceptions, having good shelter is more important than outsiders tend to recognize. So there's material, and then there's social, which is to do with good social relations. And that's gender relations and its relations within the community. Then there's physical, which is the body. And then there's security or vulnerability, which includes things to do with theft and law and order, and also physical violence and things like that. And then the last one, which in a way knits them all together, is powerlessness. Because if you've got material poverty, if you've got bad social relations, if you've got a weak body which is sick in some way, and if you're insecure, all of these knit together as powerlessness. And all of these 5 dimensions are connected together. So you ask people, what is the good life? The good life tends to be expressed as the opposite of these. It's having enough for a good life, material adequacy of some sort. It's having good social relations, including good social relations in the family. It's having a strong and fit body. It's being secure. And it's having the capacity, having the power to make choices and to be able to do things. So if you ask people, if you think about then, what about our policies? To what extent do our policies contribute to enabling people who have a bad life having a good life? Then it may be across the whole range of these, and the priorities will be different for different people. They will be different for different genders, they will be different for different castes, for different people at different levels of economic levels and so on. There's a lot of differences. But they will have their own priorities. And so, a good health service, education, which is to do with the power part of it particularly, security. These are all very, very important to people, and if we want to contribute to people's well-being and enabling them to enhance their own well-being, then we have to look at all of these and find the right balance in each particular context for each particular type of person. To think in terms of paradigms. I for a long time hesitated to use the word paradigm because I was afraid someone would ask me what it meant or what I meant by it. But I really mean.
I read a definition somewhere.
I know. Well,
do you have a definition?
Yes, I have characteristics of.
Okay.
I think one can contrast in development a paradigm of things and a paradigm of people. All right, paradigm of things. So with each of these, you have a different set of concepts, a different set of values, a different set of behaviors, a different set of methods, and a different set of relationships, those 5. So if you've got a paradigm of things, then you get a top-down, standardized programs tend to fit with this. And the output is things, latrines. All right? It's a things program.
Yeah, it's a thing.
I mean, the traditional, all over the world, I think one can reasonably say, the traditional old approach to rural sanitation has been in this top-down things mode. We must get more latrines built. You move to the people side, and it's quite different. And the methods are different, the behaviors are different, the relationships are different. It's to do with facilitating people to do their own analysis, to say, as we all know, we realize for the first time the significance of the scale on which that at all we are eating one another's shit, and we've got to stop. It's a completely different way of approaching things. It's a different paradigm. It involves a different mindset. It involves different procedures. You can't order it top down all over the country. It wouldn't work because it depends on facilitators. It depends on people who've got approaches, methods, behaviors, attitudes, who can develop relationships which are quite different from those on the things side. So what one needs to do is to distinguish between those programs where you can have a things approach, immunization, fine, you can do it, it works. And those where you need a people approach, which is rather like very much exemplified by CLTS. So on the one side you have the standardization, on the other you have the diversity. On the other, one side you have we know and we do it for you, and on the other we facilitate you to come to your own conclusions and to take your own action. I think a major dimension of this is the vulnerability to capture. And by capture, I mean capturing the resources, the money, otherwise known as corruption. That on the things side, there's money for things. When there's money for things, there's all sorts of scope for when you go to the people side, and this is where I know there's corruption in the NREGA. I mean, people tell me that. I don't know personally, but people tell me that there is. But I suspect that with the right to information, with the transparency which can be demanded and is demanded, that certainly in some areas there won't be much corruption because they can't get away with it because people are empowered. Now, I may be wrong, but I suspect that that will turn out to be the case. And part of the challenge is to shift the control of people through the transparency of the right to information and the rest of it, and through demands and through organization, through movements, to shift it to cover more and more programs. And you would know better than me whether that's happening.